Hey guys, Lady Lee here from ladyleeshome.com, and in this video we are going to can beets. This is really not a complicated process, but it is a little bit of a process, and we are going to use the pressure canner. I'll show you exactly how to do that. It's really not that hard. I grow a ton of beets in my spring and fall garden. I love eating them. I sell a lot of them, and they are actually a really good root crop to store if you have some sort of like a root cellar or cold storage. There's not much you need to do to them to store them in cold storage, but I don't have a root cellar. What I do is plant a whole lot of beets in the fall, and when the frost comes I just cover them. The ground becomes a refrigerator, and as long as the greens are protected from the frost, they are pretty much good to stay in the ground. I'm in Central North Carolina, growing zone 7B, so that's possible for us here. And if you grow in a warmer growing zone, then you can do that too. So I don't need to store a whole lot of beets, but because I really love beets and I eat them weekly really, I do can some, a few quarts just in case, just in case I run out of beets. So let me give you a little bit of a rundown of the process so you understand what we're going to do. I cleaned the beets from tops, and just remember that you can use the tops and make green patties. I'll link the recipe below. It's my favorite vegetarian recipe, really. You can saute them, you can make an omelet with them. There's a lot of different things you can do with beet tops, so don't throw them away. But I did cut the tops, and I'm leaving the root, leaving the skin. We are going to boil the beets for about 30 minutes, and after we do that it will be much easier to get rid of the skin. Clean the beets. We're gonna slice them, or just half them or quarter them, that's up to you, and then we're going to process them in the pressure canner. So that's the process, and the first thing we're going to do is just boil them. I put some water, fill this pot with water. It's actually a pasta pot, and I like to use it when I do this kind of stuff, because then I can just pull this part and it's easy to get the beets out, and they cool faster this way. So I'm going to put them in a pasta pot and turn the heat on to high on the stovetop. Put the pot on the stovetop, bring this to a boil, and then we'll boil them for about 30 minutes. After we boiled the beets for about 20-30 minutes, I took them over to the sink and took them out of the pot and ran some cold water on them, so they're easy for me to handle. They're still hot and a little steamy, but I can touch them and handle them. I also added 2 inches of water to my Presto pressure canner and put it on the stovetop, and I'm heating the water up to about 180 Fahrenheit, so simmering. So we need to do that, and we can do that while we're working on cutting the beets and peeling the beets and cutting the beets and packing the jars. I like my beets in large pieces. We are going to process them further in the pressure canner, and since we do, I don't want them to get too soft in the process, so I'm trying to boil them as little as I can, just so the skin comes out like this and it's easy to peel them. And then when I cut them, I kind of leave them in large chunks. Actually, if they are 2 inches in diameter or smaller, like this one for example, you can just cut the root and cut the top and peel it and leave the beet whole. You don't even have to cut it. But for larger beets, I will half them or maybe quarter them, no more than that. I don't dice them or slice them or anything like that. I leave the pieces as large as possible. Then what we're going to do is to place them in clean jars, and I like quart jars for canning beets. It seems to work best. You can, if you want, add about a teaspoon of salt, either kosher or sea salt or canning salt to each jar, but it's not a mandatory thing. It's optional. But you can do that, and you can season your beets too if you want to add other seasonings, but I really like to leave them plain and just can plain beets, because then I can do whatever I want with them later. I also put a kettle of water on the stove, and I'm boiling these water because that's what we're going to use to cover the beets. I think I have about 14 beets here, so that should fill the 2 quarts. We'll see, more or less. Whatever I can't fit, I'll just use for dinner tonight. So just peeling and cleaning them and packing the jars. Now that the jars are filled with the beets, I'm going to go ahead and add some boiling water. Make sure to boil clean water. You don't want to use the water that the beets were boiling in. Again, you can add a teaspoon of salt to each jar, to each quart jar if you want to. I am filling it in a way that I have about an inch of headspace left. Then the next step is just taking the bubble remover and sticking it, kind of scraping the sides of the jar just to make sure we don't have air bubbles that are stuck in there. And that's an important step. And then the last step is taking a napkin or a clean paper towel and just cleaning the rim of the jars before we center the lid and close the jars. It is okay if the beets are sticking out of the water a little bit. It doesn't matter, as long as your jars seal at the end, then it should be fine. I'm going to put these on the rack of the pressure canner. The water there is simmering at about 180 Fahrenheit. I'm going to close the canner, and then we are going to turn the heat to high and let the canner steam. I'm going to take the weight off of the vent and let it steam for about 10 minutes before I place the weight on the vent and process quart jars for 35 minutes and pint jars for 30 minutes. So I don't know if you can see, but there is steam coming out of the vent, and this is the time where I want to put my timer to 10 minutes and let it vent for 10 minutes. I am using a Presto dial gauge canner. If you're using a weighted gauge canner, then it works a little different, but still we want to let the canner steam for about 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to put my weight on the vent and watch my dial. Since I'm using a dial gauge canner, I want to process my beets for quart jars for 35 minutes, pint jars for 30 minutes on 11 psi. So I'm going to watch the dial until it gets to 11, and then I'll adjust the heat to keep 11 pounds of pressure. If you're using a weighted gauge canner, then you have to process on 10 pounds of pressure. And remember to adjust your processing and your pressure according to the altitude in which you live. So whatever I said right now is valid for whoever lives in between 0 to 1,000 feet in elevation. I have all of the adjustments and the adjustment table and all of that on the blog, in the blog post, so I'll link to that below and make sure to check that. After I put the weight on the vent and get to 11 psi and process for 35 minutes, after the processing time is done, I'm going to turn the heat off and I will not touch the canner. I'll just leave it for a couple of hours to cool down gradually. Every time we can, we just want gradual temperature changes. If we change the temperature too fast, the jars in the canner are going to break. So I'm going to leave the canner closed for a couple of hours. Just let it cool gradually all the way until the dial shows me 0 pounds of pressure. Then I will open the canner, still not remove the jars, just let them rest in the hot water for about 10 more minutes before I move them onto the counter on like a towel or the cutting board to cool overnight completely. I didn't take the jars out of the pressure canner yet. It's still cooling and it will probably take a couple of hours. I do have a couple of jars from last year that I didn't use yet, so I wanted to show you how it looks when it's all done. And you see these are from last spring, so it's pretty much a year now, a little over a year, and they're still good. Some people are concerned about losing some liquid in the jars while canning, and as long as your jar's sealed, and you can check if they're sealed by pressing on the center of the lid. If there's no movement there, then it's sealed and ready for storage, and you can store them at room temperature. As long as your jars are sealed, it's okay if you lost some liquid during canning, and even if the beets stick out of the liquid a little bit, it's still fine. You can see that nothing happened to those, and they've been on the shelf for about a year now. You can can any kind of beets, yellow beets or any other kind of beets, with this process. You have to use the pressure canner because beets are low in acid. So if you can plain beets, it's got to be with the pressure canner. I do remove the ring. Once the jar is completely cooled and ready for storage, I remove the ring because I just can monitor a little better what's happening inside the jar this way. And also sometimes if the jars are stored for a year or you know, a few months, sometimes the rings tend to rust a little bit, and I also can use them in other canning, so I can reuse them, but they tend to rust and then it's kind of hard to open the jar. So I remove the rings and store my jars on the shelf without the rings. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. The link to the blog post that have the printed recipe or the printed tutorial in it is in the notes below, and you can go ahead and go to the blog and print it out if you want to. And you can use these beets really any way. They're already soft, and you can just dice them and make a salad, or you know, fry them just a little bit with some seasonings and olive oil. There's a lot of different ways to use them. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and like, and I will see you again in the next one.